Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is artist and writer Dan Jurgens. Dan, welcome to Comic Culture.
It's nice to be here, Terrence. Thank you.
So Dan, you've worked on some of the most successful comics in all of comics history, and I'm wondering, how do you get the character worked out in your head when you're ready to start taking over a book? We were talking a little bit before we started taping how you've just wrapped up a run on Green Lantern. You're best known for your work on Superman, and now you're tackling Nightwing and Batman Beyond. So how do you look at a character and sort of get a sense of how to tell their story?
It really depends on who the character is. I mean, sometimes it'll be someone that you have it right there, right? I mean, you thought about it or maybe even had an idea of some kind when you were 13 years old or something, or somewhere in between, and somehow it's there. You just have that connection. Other times you have to look for it. You have to dig through and find it. You have to really look at the character and find out what it is that makes him or her resonate with you somehow. That you have to find that connection. So there's no set answer. Sometimes it's there and other times it can take a while. And there are other times when you try and it's just not there. And this has happened to me where I then say, this is not going to work out. This just isn't the character for me.
And when you're getting ready to start working on a book, are you going back and sort of researching what other writers have done, or is it something where you don't want to know what they've done so that way, maybe they don't influence what you're doing?
There again, both things work. Sometimes if you come on a book, and especially when it's successful, I think at that point you kind of stick with some of the things that have already been established. There are other times when it really does help not to know anything, where you just want to say, don't tell me anything. I don't want to know. Let's start fresh. Let me kind of cut from whole cloth. We can always go back and have those conversations, but first I want to decide what it is that I want to do and say, and then we'll go back and figure out how to reconcile any problems that are there. So again, it just depends exactly on who the character is and what kind of state they're in when I get there.
Let's talk a little bit about your day. So let's say you're working on something as a writer. Is this something where you come up with like a Marvel-style plot and kind of pitch it to your artist, or is this something where you're doing the full script? And sort of how do you schedule your day to make sure that you're getting everything done that you need to get done?
Just to talk a little bit about scripting styles first, I do not like to write a full script, and that is based on the fact that generally, as an artist, I did not like a full script. I worked with a couple of writers who wrote full scripts, and I thought they worked out very well because they were very visually inclined. There were other writers I worked with who wrote full script, and I didn't think they quite got what the medium of comics really is. So what I tend to do is I tend to work Marvel style. I write a plot because I think you get more visual comics that way, and I give the artist all the cues they need. I let them know what the emotional beats are, the main story beats, the settings, everything they need to know, but they then get to kind of exercise their discretion on the page and in some sense how the action will unfold. In terms of how that fits into a day, I work a fairly normal day in terms of business hours. I get up at 6. I'm usually in my office by 7:30 and working then because it's nice quiet time. I get a lot done at that time. And then really in terms of story content, in terms of overall strategy for a book or whatever, that's generally worked out with the editors, and then we just, we make it happen.
You were an artist before you started becoming, before you started writing. I guess your first writing assignment was that Booster Gold?
No, my first writing assignment was actually a book I was working on called Sun Devils. Jerry Conway was the writer, editor, and he and I were co-creators along with Roy Thomas. And Jerry got so overloaded with work, he had to kind of bow aside. And I said, well, who's the writer going to be? And he asked me if I would like to do it. He knew I was interested in writing. We always talked over the plots. I made a lot of dialogue notes and things like that in the borders. So Jerry actually gave me my first shot to write, and I am extremely indebted to him for that. And then after that, I went on and did Booster Gold.
So as an artist who's also writing your own books, how do you transition to working as a writer for some other artists? How do you sort of pull back? Maybe you want to give detailed thumbnails of a scene that you can envision in your head. How do you kind of just let them do what they want to do and and just put the words on the page?
Really sort of depends on who the artist is. There have been times when I actually do thumbnails, or I actually have done that for an entire book, other times just a page. There are other artists I've worked with. For example, when I was first doing Thor at Marvel, working with John Romita Jr. or Andy Kubert, I mean, there's nothing I'm going to tell them, right? I mean, they are incredible storytellers and artists in their own right, and all they are going to do is make anything I write look better. They elevate the work. And ideally, that's what happens. And I think once you start to establish a real relationship with an artist, especially if they're every issue, which is absolutely crucial, then you can start to build that sort of working dynamic that is, I think, that sort of give and take thing that we're all looking for and really want to hit, where you're kind of functioning almost as one in a creative sense, even though you're two different people.
Another thing that's changed since you started out is that I guess the mantra used to be at Marvel that every issue is someone's first issue, and it seems comics now have sort of deconstructed a little bit where maybe you're writing towards the trade. So I'm wondering, when you were first getting started, maybe you had a two-parter, maybe you had a subplot that would go from issue to issue, but it didn't seem like you were kind of telling one adventure over the course of 6 issues the way it seems the industry has gone now. So I was wondering if you could kind of speak a little bit about how that has changed for you as the writer and the artist.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Quite honestly, it's something that conceptually I struggle with a little bit to this day. We also had that same, so if we go back to the early mid-90s when I was working on Superman, we had that same philosophy on the Superman books, that every comic book is someone's first issue, right? And so even at that time, we were sometimes telling connected stories where someone might have been writing in Action Comics part 2 of a 5-part story, and then the next issue of Man of Steel would be part 3. What we really tried to make sure that we did, because at that time we had no thought that that stuff was going to get collected, right? I mean, trade paperbacks really didn't exist for the most part. We had no idea things would get collected at that time. So what we tried to do is approach it in such a way that each issue would sort of recap what had gone on before, kind of bring the readers up to speed with that sense that, yes, it's someone's first issue. To a certain extent, I still try and do that today. So if I'm writing a 6-part story in Batman Beyond, I try and make sure that somewhere along the line in that issue, I give them enough information so that if they did not see the issue before, that they're not totally lost in the woods. Because I know that happens to me as a reader very often, where I'll walk into a comic store sometime and I'll just grab like 10 books just to check things out. People will say, hey, Dan, you have to read this, you have to look at that, whatever. And then I start to read them and I can't figure out, for love nor money, what is going on between the covers. So it's something I still am aware of. I wonder if that's where we really need to be as an industry. But it is where we are, because the entire concept of trades has become a much bigger part of things.
I think I read somewhere that I guess DC or Marvel, they make more sales on a collection than they do on the single issue, which when you pick up that issue, there is something exciting about it, especially if it's well written, where you feel like you can kind of jump in on that story. But I can also see the point of view that it's satisfying. I can read all 6 issues and have a complete story from beginning to end with all those beats in between. Now, one thing I did want to talk about was when you were working on Superman, you were working as 4 or 5 books a month with another group of creators. And that takes a lot of coordination, but you've also worked on some of these crossover events, whether it was 0 Hour that you were the force behind, or whether it was some other event that was happening throughout the line. So how does that affect you as a creator? How do you sort of coordinate a bunch of different creators on different characters to tell one story and have that sort of make sense? And how does that impact you if it's not your story that you're telling?
It can burn you out. I mean, it's a lot of work. I have said before that when I did 0 Hour, when I wrote and drew that, it was 5 issues that came out weekly. So we had 5 issues that shipped in 5 weeks that I wrote and drew. And I would defy anyone to try that today, because I don't see anyone with the guts to do it. because at the same time, you are reading through every other story that every writer generates. You're working with them or their editor to make sure that everything dovetails the way it's supposed to, that it is as seamless as possible. In order to do that, you're really investing an incredible amount of time in that effort. And to get back to Zero Hour, even when I was doing that, I was also still writing and drawing Superman. That was a part of it that crossed over. It's not a fun way to work. It's fun to have the original idea and to say, I want to make this big statement, and then midway into the project, it's bogging down. You find yourself working with other people so much that you're not getting your own stuff done. But once you get through it, once you get to that last page of that last issue, you have this tremendous sense of accomplishment. And I'm glad I went through it. It's a good drill to have done. I think it was still a credible project, but there is nothing else in comics like it that, ultimately as writers or artists, we are generally, I think, designed to sort of sit in our studios or offices and generate our own personal story, almost without talking to anyone else to a certain degree. So by the time you're into that massive crossover, in many ways, it is the most opposite of the reason you're ever doing comics, because you are working with so many people and so many characters just trying to get this massive effort right.
It's almost like you say you're dealing with all of these other creators to get the story right, to get the characters right. So for something like that, you're penciling the 5 issues. Is that something where you're 5 months out and you're doing an extra issue a month, or is this something where you're not sleeping for a couple of weeks because you want to get this done as quickly as possible?
It's actually both. I think when we first started, we were probably really, by the time I put pencil to paper, probably a good 4 months out. And with the awareness of exactly how the deadlines had to work and how time was going to collapse. But no matter what you plan for, you can't plan for everything. And you can't possibly anticipate everything that comes up. And it also sort of requires everybody else to be on time as well. So if there are 30 other books that are crossing over with yours, they all have to be there. And that never happens. It just doesn't. So you can plan for it as best you can, but nevertheless, you get to the last few weeks and it's 24/7. It really is.
It's interesting because, your career at that point is well established, and I'm sure that there's a time when you're wondering if you're going to make that finish line, or if there's going to be some stumble. So I noticed that at some point you switched over from doing full pencils to breakdowns. It would be in the credits of Superman, I might say that it was breakdowns and then finishes by someone like Brett Breeding, right, or someone else. So what is the difference between a breakdown and a full pencil?
Somewhat depends on the artist. My breakdowns are still tighter than some people's full pencils. And because everyone has their own sort of stylistic idiosyncrasies that work that way. For me, it's a looser form of penciling. All the backgrounds are fully ruled out, fully put in place. All the stuff is there. What tends not to be there are a lot of line weight suggestions. It was a technique that I really evolved more for me when I was both writing and drawing Superman as well as writing and drawing Justice League. And that's what really made it possible for me to do 2 books a month. I think the other benefit to it is that I was able to work with some tremendously talented anchors, whether it was Art T. Bear or Jerry Ordway or Brett Breeding, or more recently Norm Ratmond or Kevin Nolan or Klaus Janson, who I worked with on Spidey. And there have been so many guys, and I'm sorry if I forgot anyone, but it allows them to, I think, exercise a little more personal expression in the work as well. And I think it makes for a nice, unique dynamic that it means some of the projects end up looking a little bit different from the one you did just before that, which is a nice idea. It gives things a little bit of a different sense to them. So I found it to be very effective, and at the same time found that the artists, the inkers or finishers that I was working with really seemed to like it as well, because it gave them a chance to get a little bit more of their personality on the page. It's
interesting to hear that, because you look at some people's breakdowns. I think John Buscema had some breakdowns that I've seen from his Avengers run, his second Avengers run in the 80s.
Right.
And they were fairly loose, but at the same time you could see the body language and the personality that was in there, but maybe the backgrounds weren't as rendered. So it seems that you were somewhere between John Buscema and let's say John Byrne, who's noted for having lines so heavy that you didn't need inks, you could just kind of photograph those.
As I said, it gets back to sort of the stylistic idiosyncrasies that we all have. Buscema was able to communicate so much in just a simple few lines that it was quite astounding. And in terms of the Avengers work that you had mentioned, as I recall, most of that was inked by Tom Palmer, who is, when it comes to doing finishes, there are few guys who ever hit the level he did. He was just so brilliant at it, and still is. I was privileged enough to get him to work over me a couple of times. It's like, wow, Tom Palmer, and that's very much how it goes. Other guys are so loose. I remember seeing someone once draw basically sort of a circle with 4 sticks under it and said cow, and he wrote right on it cow, and left it up to the inker then to really have to turn that circle with 4 sticks into a cow. So I would never be able to work that loosely. What I feel is necessary is that as I draw, if I'm doing breakdowns, I have to be able to communicate what it is that I think is important.
You've worked primarily for DC Comics, but you've also done work for Marvel and some of the independents. So I'm wondering, when you are leaving Superman and you're going over to do Thor or Spider-Man, how do you sort of get to Marvel? I mean, obviously they want to have somebody who's got your track record, but how do you approach them? How do you get those characters, top-tier characters, and start working on them?
Well, before I ever went to Marvel, they had called me and offered me a number of different things, and we'd talk about it, and it just wasn't quite the right move to make. And I want to say, I think it was like 1995, they asked me if I wanted to do Spider-Man, and it's like, yeah, okay, now is the time to go. You're going to let me write and draw Spider-Man? That'll work. It ended up not being the greatest pairing, and so we, after about 7-8 months, we both decided to go our own ways, but we did so on a good, friendly basis, so that then a couple of years later, when they called me up, Tom Brevoort called me one day and asked me if I had had any interest in Thor. They had actually offered me Thor once about 4 or 5 years earlier, and I turned it down, and at this point, they hadn't been publishing Thor for a while. They said, you get to pretty much start over again with it. It hasn't been on the stands for a while, so you're kind of, you get the chance. Everybody has kind of stepped back from Thor a little bit, so you get to do what you want to do. JR Jr. is going to draw it. I'm like, yeah, I'm there. Okay, let's go. And it's often it is right place at the right time with both you as a creator and the character sort of being in the right stages where it has to be able to work.
And it's interesting because you're taking a character, like you said, that hadn't been published in a while, and you turn him into a critical and sales success. So when you're working on that sort of thing, are the expectations that you're going to revive the character, or is it just like, anything that we get at this point is going to be better than nothing?
The funny thing is, on Thor, one of the guys in the office said, I don't know if there's a place for Thor anymore in this world. And this was 1998. He said, when Thor first showed up, he was a god. Now gods are a dime a dozen in comics. When Thor first showed up, he had long hair. Now everybody in comics has long hair, and he has the dialogue style, and things have gotten, at that point, image had become such a thing, and it was this idea that I just don't know if Thor has a place in the market. And I said, let's find out. And we made it work. But I think often, it is funny that often when you take on a project, there are those who will say, wow, well, geez, good luck, and that's why I think as a writer, as a creator, you really have to believe in what it is that you're going to do. You have to believe in your vision. You have to believe in where you want to go and in the direction. And find other people who agree with you. You can't do it alone. You have to have, at the very least, someone in editorial who is on the same page with you, and ideally more. But you have to have that sense of what it is you want to do, what it is you have to say, and where you want to go with it.
When you're working on a book like Thor or Superman, how far out are you working with your ideas? Is it something where you're hoping that you'll find the inspiration for the next arc somewhere in the one that you're working on, or do you have I've got a grand vision, it's going to be this, followed by this, followed by that?
Yeah, sometimes, and I apologize for the fact that so many of my answers are coming down to, well, it depends on who it is, but it does. I mean, there are some times where you walk onto a project, or I have anyway, and it's sort of like I have this 3-year plan where we're going to start here and work all the way through here, and these are the steps that will get us there. Other times it's more like 1 year, and then as you're putting together that year, the second year, and beyond that, the third year are falling into place a little bit. And some of it is because, I don't think you want to write with your feet nailed to the floor under you, that you have to be able to be flexible and move on. And quite honestly, there are many times when you're working on something where you said, by the end of this story, we're going to be in Kathmandu, and then all of a sudden you realize, well, no, I don't want to be there. We're going to be in Canada, whatever, and you need to be flexible as well. But ideally, you always have that sort of, we're going to start here, work our way to this point, and then if all things go according to plan, we'll get through to this final destination.
I was speaking recently with Carl Kiesel, who mentioned that he believes that Superman has the best supporting characters in all of comics. And I was wondering, not whether you disagree or agree, but how you use supporting characters to help further along the story, because I think a lot of us think about Superman's fighting Lex Luthor, but a lot of times it's a little bit more interesting to find out what Lois and Perry and Jimmy and the rest of the gang at the Planet are up to.
I think with regards to Superman especially. So for me, Clark Kent defines Superman. Superman does not define Clark Kent. Clark Kent defines Superman. And in many ways, Lois Lane defines Clark, and by extension, it's Lois who defines Superman. And I think the fact that Clark Kent can have a relatively healthy, happy, normal life, that he can be married to Lois Lane, that they now have a son, that he has this nuclear family that is intact, that is also his background, that despite coming from Krypton, he was raised by the Kents, and he has this intact family experience. That really defines, I think, who Superman is. And as an inspirational figure of this character of hope, this beacon for the better, things like that. So to me, that's not even supporting cast material. It is Superman without Lois Lane, who showed up in the first issue of Action Comics, just as Superman did, is almost like a broken character. You have something substantially different at that point. That is not true of every character, so it's my long-winded way of saying in some ways they aren't even supporting characters. Perry is, yes. Jimmy Olsen is, yes, but I certainly don't think of Lois that way, nor do I think of Jonathan Kent now in that light.
I guess what you're saying is because of that dynamic, the way that they help form that character, it's Lois is actually a co-lead, and the more we get that in our heads, the better we're going to be. Because thinking back to those great Superman stories, it was always about something that Lois and Clark were going through while there was this disaster happening.
Right. Well, and I think Batman acts out of vengeance. Batman had a horrible tragedy visited upon him as a child when his parents were killed, and everything he does now is really, I don't think it's about justice. I think it's about vengeance. Superman, I think, on the other hand, is about doing the right thing and making the world a better place. Those are substantially different motives. And to that extent, that's why I think with Superman, so much a part of it is someone with these godlike powers who, despite all that, wants to have a normal human life. So I think that says everything about them. So yeah, co-leads by all means.
And I see we have about 2.5 minutes before we have to wrap up our conversation. I was wondering, it's, I guess, immodest for me to ask this question, but you've been associated with Superman for the better part of 30 years. And I was wondering, looking back at your work, whether it was the death of Superman, whether it was the marriage of Lois and Clark, whether it was your recent run on Action Comics, what do you sort of see your imprint, your legacy on that character as?
I'm the wrong person to ask. I think the fact that I was able to do the character in different ways in different eras is important because it, I think, shows that I have something to say about Superman, that there's a connection there, that there that I was able to tell valid stories that enriched the character and his legacy. But ultimately, that's really up to the readers to decide. It's like, as a creator, you are your own worst judge in many ways, and that would probably be my overall answer.
And then I guess as we are getting close to wrapping up, Booster Gold, one of my favorite characters to come out of the 80s, sort of captured the zeitgeist of the time. He's a superhero who wants to be famous. So is there a Booster Gold story that you have? You don't have to tell me the story, but is there one that you've got that you think you could tell now?
I think Booster Gold has more relevance today than he ever did in this age of celebrity and social media, and how we react to that and the role in the world. And not only do I have one story, I have a bunch of stories.
So is this something that... So this is something basically, if we were to just, get on the phone and start... No, I'm not going to suggest calling DC and saying we want Dan Jurgens back on Booster Gold. But Dan, I see we have run out of time. I'd like to thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to talk with us today. I'd like to thank you at home for watching Comic Culture. We will see you again soon. Comic Culture is a production of the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke.